review anything or just watch it at your leisure. For questions, for those of you who are here, if you have questions, we can handle those as we go. If you're online, you can type questions into the chat and they will be brought out, and we'll hopefully be able to address questions from folks online as well as in person. Before I get too much further, I want to thank Aaron Bullock, who is here to be our assistant and to run questions and field logistical problems as we're doing this. And also especially Steve McBride, who, come on up. Steve McBride is the host for us here at Good Shepherd and is also the master of technology. So Steve has made an important sacrifice of his time to help us out. Here you go. For certification? Yep, here you go. Okay. If you go to the first page of your packet there, I've tried to summarize the very basic elements of the procedural stuff for this exam. This is a sort of a skeleton of the information that you can get online. So I'm not going to go through all this because you can look up all of this information online at AAGOHQ.org under the Education tab on their website. As far as dates, all of the exams are still up and available for the first part of 2022. So if you want to take one, you can take any exam that you want. Application deadlines are very important. If you miss the registration deadline, you won't take the exam that year, and you might have to wait as much as an entire year to take it, depending on what you're interested in working on. So those dates are very important. Where it says certification, in order to receive certification, you have to get 50% on every item on the test and 70% on the overall test or section of the test that you're taking. That's really important to keep in mind because what it means, it's not an excuse for sloppy work, but it does mean that you don't have to be perfect when you're playing these exams. You have to show your competence and that you've put in the time to learn the skills in a general way. They're not looking for perfection. So hopefully that takes a little bit of pressure off as you're taking an exam. For preparation for the exam, generally, the Guild website is fantastic. There are so many resources there. And they are, in the case of service playing and colleague, they're incredibly complete. They really will walk you through every part of the test. So I highly recommend those. Do note there's prize money for some of these, which is great. I received a choir master prize, and it was fantastic because it paid me to take the exam. Totally incredible. So do your best, and maybe you'll get the prize. That's a really great incentive. Okay, as to the content of the exams and what we're talking about tonight, I've put just a little bit of information about the literature portion, hymn playing and accompaniment. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight because those are the sections of the exams that people can approach the most easily. Basically, you're playing what's on the page. You do need to take the repertoire, practice, learn the repertoire, be sensitive to the style, the period, so that your registrations are appropriate. Be sensitive to the fact that if you're accompanying singers, even if singers are not present in the room during the exam, that you're making accommodations for singers breathing, the meaning of the text, things like that. Recordings are very helpful, particularly if you're not in lessons with someone. The repertoire for the exams is familiar repertoire, so there are ample recordings that you can listen to get a sense of what you need to do. But generally, the literature, hymns, accompanying, that's kind of the easy part of the exam. The challenging part, the hard part of the exam is in the skills section, things like sight reading, transposition, which gives me a headache when I work on it. It is possible to do, but these are the things that cause people fear of taking the exams. And the reason for that is that they are largely an internal sort of musical process that you need to pull from a constellation of skills that you have in order to approach some of these skills successfully. For example, transposition. If I came in and said, here's the original example and played it, and then said, here's the transposition and played you the transposition, you would get exactly zero information from that. There's a lot that has to go on mentally. So we're going to talk through those things, but that's what makes these particular skills challenging. Each exam has sight reading, no matter what level, and transposition for all except, I think, the choir master exam. So we're going to start with sight reading and transposition because that applies no matter what level that you are attempting. Harmonization and improvisation are not part of the service playing test. They are part of the colleague test. If you want to stay, if you're doing service playing or considering that and you want to stay here or stay online and listen to those other, I think it can enrich your experience of sight reading and transposition as well, because it's a similar set of skills. But that we're going to spend about a half an hour on the first part. And if you want to go at the end, I'll let you know when we finish the service playing portion and you can log off or leave if you would like. We do have a couple of people who are interested in the associate exam. And if there's time at the end, or we may add just a little special session for one of the improvisation questions for the associates, because that's a slightly more advanced application of that skill. Okay, any questions before we start the skills portion? Ready to move? All right, we're going to start with sight reading on page 1A. You might have to unclip to see the little number in the corner. On page 1A, you see in front of you an example that's taken from the service playing sight reading example booklet that's available online. All levels have sight reading. The service playing test does not require you to use pedals. You can use manuals only. As you go through the levels, the demands increase. You have to use pedals for the colleague exam. You have to have manual changes and dynamics or open score or clefs and all. It gets very difficult, but just for a starting point, let's look at this example here. In the upper left-hand corner, you see you have a time limit of preparation for this when you take the test. 60 seconds is not a lot of time. You don't have the opportunity to play any portion of this before you start playing for the exam. So what I recommend is adopting a sort of list of procedure. I've given you a list here, things to look for that will be a mental preparation to help you avoid the pitfalls that you might find in the example. The key here is to try and avoid being startled and surprised by what you see as you're playing. The list that I put here is good for me. You may find that there are other things that are important or that some of these are not important, and you can develop your own list as you practice. The last thing on this page, the judges are going to be listening for you to keep a steady pulse and for you to continue without stopping. And it doesn't matter how many wrong notes you play, keep going, okay? That can be very difficult in itself. All right, let's go to 1B. In the case of something like this, they recommend a soft register, yes, to represent that. On page 1B, we're going to take the first couple of those things, procedural things from the list. Number 1, what key are you in? I don't know about you. I take the key signature so often in my life. I'm playing a piece, of course, a piece that I know, and I'll suddenly wonder, what key is this in? I mean, I can play this piece, but I think we take that for granted a lot. For sight reading, look at the key signature. It can save you a lot of trouble if you know exactly what the key signature is. In this example, if you look in the pickup to bar 1, those first 3 notes, G, A, B flat, those would suggest probably G minor rather than B flat major, but there's not a whole lot of information there. Let's go to the last bar, bar 8, you can see it ends on G. So we know this is G major. The other thing that we know, I'm sorry, G minor. That is a Picardy third there at the end. The other thing we know about this is that you are going to see B flats, you're going to see E flats, and you're going to see F sharps and sometimes E naturals, because those are all things that are part of the G minor constellation of pitches. So you already have an advantage as to the notes that you're going to see and can expect. Number 2 is tempo. If you look at the tempo indication, it says andante. That's not a whole lot of information. It narrows the range, but it's not a whole lot. We know it's 4/4, which means a quarter note is getting our main pulse. What if we go down to measure 2? You see 16th notes. That's the smallest note value in this whole thing. So you know that it might be wise to keep in mind how you want to play 16th notes in this tempo as you are sight reading. If you set a tempo that's too fast at the beginning, you could be in trouble later. I look also at bar 6, which is a very busy measure. There's all kinds of stuff, leaps and 16ths and parallel 6 and all. We might want to get an andante tempo from there. So for example, for this piece, da, 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 dee, dee, dee. So this tempo, maybe a little slow for your average andante, but it might work well for you for this example. Number 3 on that list is rhythm. We've already identified 16th notes. Take a look at bar 4. In this example, we have dotted rhythms and triplets. We're going to want to make sure that those dotted rhythms don't sound like triplets so that the rhythm comes through clearly. Okay, let's try page 1C to finish off some of these things from our list. Scan the piece for pitches. You're looking for accidentals, some of which we've accounted for already. You're looking for awkward passages, leaps, things like that. If you look at bar number 2, I put a circle around that F sharp at the beginning of the bar. When I prepared this, I actually got this out and I went through my procedure and then tried sight reading this thing. I played the the F sharp at the beginning of the measure, but if you look at the end of the bar, I missed the F sharp at the end of the bar. And the same thing happened to me in measure 5. I've circled that A flat and drawn the arrow. I missed the A flat at the end of the bar. That's kind of a dumb mistake, but I learned that for me, I need to look for those things if I'm preparing a sight reading example. You can also look again at that tricky bar number 6. There are a lot of leaps there. That is a measure that you might actually want to envision yourself playing that right-hand part. How are you going to finger that? How are you going to approach the 6th? Are you going to pivot over your thumb and get the F sharp with your second finger, for example? The pitches are complicated there. Take a moment and work out what you're going to do. Number 5 on our list is harmony. How do the accidentals that you see relate to harmonic implications? It can be much easier if you are able to see chord structures in the music to address an accidental than if you just treat it as an isolated sharp or natural that you just have to play. For example, in bar 2, I've circled a C sharp there. That, if you look at the whole of beat 4, becomes part of a dominant 7th chord on A. And for me, at least, I find it's easier to realize what to do with that when I'm just able to grab it as a chord, mentally grab it as a chord. And then you can see it moves to D major, and then the C natural and the B natural that are circled in the next bar show you that it's now a dominant 7th on D going to G. Those kinds of structures can help you. I actually went ahead and identified some more chords on the 3rd line. You have a half note worth of harmony in each of those measures. And it can be very helpful to read harmony while you're trying to read every individual pitch. The context is helpful, at least to me. Finally, technique. You're not required to use pedal for sight reading in service playing. So if you look at the last bar there, if you were playing manuals alone, you might take not the last bar, but bar 7. You might take B natural and C with the right hand so that you can make that left hand arpeggio. That is the extent of my list of things. I would be happy to play this for you. Of course, I'm not actually sight reading because I have prepared this already. But does anyone care to hear what it sounds like? Would that be helpful? Again, it's process. Do you want to hear it? Sure? Okay. Before I play, do you have any questions? Okay, let me just play through this. Now, what I'm going to do is try and set a steady tempo. I'm going to try and keep going no matter what. Hopefully, I won't make any mistakes. I didn't really practice it, but I've played it over a couple of times, so I probably will do okay. But if I do make a mistake, I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going. All right, let's see how I do. Got them all. It helped me to have gone through that process. You can, yes, you can, and you can choose where. I think this example is actually a good example of how the sight reading is tailored so that you can use pedal or not. I mean, the baseline in this moves at a very reasonable pace. So for the service playing exam, if you use pedals, it's not going to challenge you terribly. And they do that on purpose. That arpeggio at the end is probably the most difficult part if you were going to approach that with pedal. So I advise, as you prepare sight reading at any level, that you have some procedure that you can use to get identified the important and difficult passages before you start playing. 60 seconds isn't a lot of time, but I actually did my whole list in 60 seconds. So we good on sight reading? You want to look at the next example? This is the one that I think is the most difficult. Transposition on example number 2. This is taken from this past year's colleague exam. Service playing and colleague exam both give preparation time for the transposition example. For the service playing, you get to choose the hymn that you would like to transpose out of the hymn booklet provided by the Guild on their website. And you can take as long as you want to practice it. You can use whatever techniques work for you, and you could even write it out. You could even memorize it in different keys if you really want. When you are at the exam, you will not be able to play from something else that you've written out. You will have to play from the original key. So keep that in mind as you're preparing. For the colleague, you have preparation time in a separate room, preparation room. You have 20 minutes. So you can spend time on transposition, but you might not want to spend all 20 minutes on it. So again, this is a case where you want to maximize your time. For the other exams, associate and further on, you get 60 seconds to look at it in the exam, and then you play. So it gets more and more challenging. Now this again is a matter of finding ways so that you can incorporate a lot of information quickly and contextualize it so that you're not trying to read every single note. And I'll give you an example. If I asked you to play a C major triad, you could play a C major triad. Now, if I asked you to transpose that triad up a major second, you would think C major, up a second, D major. And you'd play a D major triad. You wouldn't think C is going up to D, the E is going up to F sharp in this case, and the G is going up to an A. That's way too long. It's too many steps to be effective as a tool for transposing. Does that make sense? So it's much easier to think of that as a chord and transpose the chord to what you know would be its equivalent chord than to transpose every note. When you start transposing, you will probably, if you've never done it before, you will probably find yourself reading a lot of pitches and thinking, what is that up a step? And that's okay, because that's kind of where everyone starts. But I have, yet again, another list here of different ways of thinking about this, things you can identify that will contextualize the notes and hopefully reduce the amount of that executive decision-making note by note. For example, number one, what is the key of the original and what are the keys that you're going to? In this case, we're in F major and they're asking us to go up a whole step and down a half step. I've made a little chart at the bottom. You can see up a whole step is G major, key signature is 1 sharp. Going down a half step is E major, and that's 4 sharps. Again, for me, reminding myself that those accidentals exist in that key, it really does help me. The scale that you use for those keys is something that you need to have facility with so that you're not thinking about playing in that key. Your hands just kind of are playing in the new key without too much processing. So identifying the key and the relationships is important. Number 2 on the list is accidentals. The accidentals that are in the example don't go, or they're not typically part of the key of the example. They're usually pushing you somewhere else. And then in the new key, those accidentals will have to be accounted for. And very often, in fact, almost all the time, a flat in your original example will not be a flat in the key you're transposing to. So for example, in bar number 4, the B natural and the bass, I put in a little box there, and you can see that B natural is actually going to be a C sharp or an A sharp, depending on which key we're going to. So when you see a natural, you are now thinking sharp in the key that you're going to. The flat in the same bar, that becomes a natural in the key that you're going to. So when you see an accidental in your example, you have to rethink that. And it's good to process that in advance of playing. Harmony, that's number 3 on the list. This is a nice example because as I was scanning through this, I looked at bar 1 and looked at the notes and thought, well, it's pretty much just F major with some passing tones. It's pretty much, bar 2 is just pretty much B flat major with, again, some passing tones. I went through the whole thing. I stopped on bar 4. I put a couple question marks there because when I stopped there, just a quick scan, I didn't know immediately what that was, which meant to me, I would actually need to go back to what we talked about at the beginning. When I get to that, I'm going to need to know what notes to play rather than analyzing the harmony and just grabbing that chord. So that, if you know how much harmony you can spot by eye, measure by measure, and know where you need to rely on another skill set, another tool, that can be helpful. That is actually a 7 half diminished 7 of 5, which I don't know about you, but in whatever key I'm in, I'm not just going to reach out and grab a 7 half diminished 7 of 5 in that key. And that half diminished symbol didn't come out very well in this printout, but that's what that is. But for me, I know I'm going to need to look at that actual bass note and know that it's a C sharp, for example, so that I can grab that. Cadences is the next one on the list. I marked the cadence pattern here with that big box near the end. If you've practiced cadences in all the keys and various inversions using different predominant chords or whatever, when you get to the cadence, at least I find, I kind of relax a little bit because I know that pattern. I've done that pattern. And that's another way that you can take the decision-making out of it by becoming very familiar with cadence patterns in different keys. Number 5 is technique. It's much like in the sight reading example. Is there a place where the reach is going to be too big if you're not playing with pedals? I've identified 2 of those. There's one in bar 4 where I'm going to take that the upper 3 notes with the right hand. And similarly in bar 6, those tenths in the bass clef, I'm not going to try and get that with one hand. It can be helpful just to know that before you start playing. Final thing I wanted to mention in this, oh, you know, I kind of overlooked my chart there a little at the bottom. I did identify in that little chart the common harmonies used in those keys, so that when I see F major and it's going to B flat major, I know that's tonic and subdominant. And I know in G major, the tonic is G and the subdominant is C, for example. So that's, again, contextualizing for the new key. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Last thing, steps and common tones. If you have two of the same note in a row, you plant whatever finger it is, like in measure 1 on the C in the alto, you plant your finger on there and forget it for beat 2, because you're not going anywhere. Those kind of steps, if you can play steps in the new key, if you practice the scales and know what they are and your hand's pretty good at it, you're thinking a lot less about the specific pitches and more about the contour in the key. And again, that's a way of keeping you from having to make decisions about every note. Does all that make sense in terms of contextualizing what you're seeing? I'd be happy to play this for you if you want to hear it. I'd be happy to transpose it. This is my worst skill. I guarantee I will make mistakes if I transpose this. But like I said, I don't know how much it would be beneficial for you to watch me mess up transposition. Does anybody want to hear it? Or should we just go ahead? I feel like we should just go ahead. The other ones are more interesting. Okay, moving ahead, we're now into harmonization. These skills are not specific to the service playing. If you want to take your packet and go, I will not be offended. If you want to stay on, I think you can get something out of the other sections. So we're on 3A. Much like the other examples, I have created a little bit of a checklist here, steps that we can take in order to harmonize a melody that we've never seen before. This skill is actually on several of the examinations, and they get more and more complicated. This one is taken from a colleague exam, the one from last year. I'm going to just play this tune for you, because in any exam, except for the most advanced, they do give you the opportunity to play it over once, at least. In the colleague, you can take this to the preparation room and work on it. So here's your tune. It's a pretty straightforward tune. Let's look at 3B and tackle some of these steps one at a time. Just listening to that, it's pretty obvious that this is D major and not B minor. Much like the sight reading example, you can always go to the end and look at what note it ends on. It's, in this case, definitely it's D major. So we know how to play in D major, and we can decide what kind of chords we might use in D major just straight off. The next thing to look for is accounting for accidentals, which always implies some sort of modulation or tonicization of a new key area. Bar 3, we have a G sharp that is pointing us towards A major, at least temporarily. We have also a cadence at the end of the first line. It's a place where we can apply a cadence formula or whatever, but we do know that we're going to stay in A major on that last chord. Bar number 5, no more G sharp, so we know we're going back towards D major. And then at the end, we have another cadence. It's going to be a cadence pattern that we have to apply there to end in D major. Non-chord tones, there aren't many in here. Any pitch in the melody that we don't want to harmonize for whatever reason, we might as well identify them so we can ignore them later. First bar is a great example. An 8th note on the weak part of a weak beat, that's not important. You could, if you want, you could harmonize. I'm sorry. could harmonize that, but that's a step that's just a little bit beyond. Why not ignore the passing tones, for example? In bar 4, that one's kind of interesting. There are 2 notes there, but if you think cadentially and what harmonies might be there, either one of those is a chord tone or a non-chord tone, depending on how you think of it. But you can pretty much ignore that, and you'll see it when we see the harmonization ultimately. Let's turn to 3C and start looking at chords. What we're going for is to try and figure out how many chords we need to use, how often do we need to change, and then what kinds of chords should we use. The first bit of advice I will give you, when you are harmonizing something like this, stick with the primary chords. Tonic, dominant primarily, subdominant, maybe a 2-chord or a 6-chord if you absolutely have to, but the more variety of harmony you put in there, and you could do a full Bach chorale treatment of this if you want and get very creative, it's really beyond the scope of the exam. So let's keep it simple. We're going to do primarily tonic and dominant, and occasionally some subdominant or secondary types of chords. If you look at the first bar, one of the bits of advice that I got out of the the colleague preparation booklet, what they suggest is if there are skips, then try to find a chord that will encompass those skips and don't harmonize every note differently. The first bar, we have D, we're going to skip over the E because that's a non-chord tone, and we have an F sharp. Both of those pitches are in the tonic chord. Let's just not bother trying to come up with another chord there. We're just going to leave it tonic. Look at bar 2. We have steps in the melody there, and the same packet advised that when you have steps, you almost always are going to have to change chords on those steps. And you can see that the E is not in the tonic chord, but it is in the dominant chord. The F sharp is in the tonic chord, but not in the dominant chord, and so on it goes. So these steps are requiring chord changes pretty much every beat. So we understand a little bit now about how the harmonic rhythm is going to go. This is basically a hymn tune. And if you play hymns at all, you change chords a lot. So that's how we're going to go about harmonizing this. Once you have all that information figured out, you start putting in the chords based on the note that's in the melody, whether it goes in the tonic or the dominant, or whether you need to go somewhere else. I've actually done this 2 different ways for you. There's chord symbols, lead sheet style above, like guitar chords, if you ever play from a lead sheet. It shows you which chord and what would be in the bass. For example, beat 4 of the example, it's a D chord. I'm deciding to put F sharp in the bass just to make a more interesting bass line. I've also done the Roman numeral style, which is more like you might have done in music theory class, keyboard harmony, what have you. Either works. If you're taking the colleague exam, this may be as much information as you put on this sheet, and you'll go into the exam and just play from this, because it would take a long time to write out all 4 parts. For this session, I've written out all 4 parts for you so you can see it. That's example 3D. There are only a couple of things I wanted to describe to you on this page. One of which is, in the right hand, I have put all of the triads in as close position as possible. And in the left hand, or the pedal, if you wanted to use pedal, I'm going to play the bass note only. And the reason for that, if you play out of your hymnal on Sunday with a harmonization that's printed, what you are playing is basically vocal music. Those parts are written for singers, and you double those for your singers. When you use that type of wider spacing, you can create more interesting lines for the singers, but you also have to be careful about your voice leading. You don't want parallel octaves, parallel fifths. The more you spread those voices out as you play, the more you're going to have to account for them and keep track of how they are all moving. If you play close position, right hand, all the notes crammed together pretty much as closely as you can pack them, as you move the chords, you are by and large going to skip all of the traps of voice leading, almost all of the traps of voice leading. So you're doing yourself a favor to keep it very simple in this spacing. When I said almost all cases, there are cases you do need to be careful of, and I've marked one in bar 1. There are 2 chords there at the end of the bar, beat 3 and beat 4. One is in root position and one is in first inversion. For a root position chord, in this case, we have D in the bass. We also have a D in the right-hand part, in the middle of the chord, in that chord. So you have 2 Ds, you're doubling the root of the chord. And for any root position chord, that's really what you're aiming for. Now take the next chord on beat 4. It's a first inversion chord, which means the F sharp is in the bass. If you look at the right hand, I've taken the F sharp out of that position for the right hand. I'm doubling, in this case, the root. And the reason for that is if you double the third of that chord in the right hand, you'll have 2 F sharps on the keyboard. And if you go to the next chord, you will automatically have parallel octaves. In playing this example, maybe the judges won't hear that if you did it that way. But as a rule of thumb, if you have a first inversion chord and you double either the root or the fifth instead of doubling that third, you can avoid setting yourself up for those parallel octaves. There's a similar case on the bottom line. In this circled section, you have a root position chord with the third in the soprano, followed by another root position chord with the third in the soprano. And what the risk is there is parallel everything, which is definitely a no-no in tonal common practice harmonization. You don't want parallel everything. So in this case, what I've done 2 things actually. The main thing is it's that the right hand goes up and the left hand with bass line goes down. And there, you're not going to have parallel everything. You're going to separate those things so that we're actually going 2 different directions. The other thing I did was I changed the doubling in the G major chord so that there's only 1 bass note, one G. So that is 2 ways that you can help yourself with voice leading. So I'm going to just play this thing over for you so you can hear what that sounds like with the close position and the bass line in the left hand alone. Sounds like church. Any questions about harmonization? In the associate exam, if you're interested in that, you'll have an example that has melody for half of it and then bass for half of it. So you get to harmonize from a bass. Practicing wise, just harmonizing a scale can be very useful. If you do choir rehearsals and they sing scales, it's a great opportunity for you to practice too. Example, and I use the same principle with the close position in the right hand, the doublings for first inversions, all of that the same, and it ends up being pretty smooth. So that's one way you can practice that technique. Yes. On the test, you can go back to the first page of example 3. That is what you see on the test. No information at all. You're not given any chords or any hints. You have to go through and supply those yourself. If you are taking a colleague exam, I'm pretty sure when you have this, they even give you scratch staff paper. You're allowed to mark on those pages. I'm pretty sure you can write in those chords and take it to the organ. That you don't have to memorize this. I would recommend looking in the manual of procedure, which is available online. It seems to indicate to me that you can carry the write the chords in and take it. And that's why they give you time to prepare. Okay. This is the good part. This is where I get excited. Anytime there's improvisation, I get excited. 4A, there are several options on the colleague exam and in addition on all the other exams that include improvisation. There are several options in the improvisation category. You can usually play 2 phrases that modulate to different keys without any sort of thematic guidance at all. You can, in this case, I've chosen the modulating bridge for a hymn. I know the associate thing gives you a hymn tune, melody only, and you're supposed to play a prelude on it. There are all kinds of options here. I chose this one because this is a very systematic way of addressing a modulating improvised bridge. And it works every time. And it also is the example that gives you the most information to work with. What they give you is 2 hymns, which they provide, and they tell you to provide a modulating bridge that will take you from the end of the first hymn set you up into the beginning of the second hymn. So step 1, and it should be about 30 seconds. Step 1 here for us in the list that's below that little rubric, play the end of the first tune. That's the first thing you have to do when you're playing this example. If you turn the page to 4B, I've given you the tune, the first tune, and I've marked the end of that. So that's really all you have to do with the first hymn, is play that little bit. I also notice that it's in D major and it's in 2/4. All right, the next thing that we're going to do to create this bridge, back on page 4A, that second line there, is we're going to introduce a motive and the new meter from the second hymn. If you look at page 4C, you will see that we are in F major. So we are going from D major to F major. We're in 2/4 here as well, which is very convenient. So we don't actually have to change meter here. But if it were in 3/4, the key to that is when you start your bridge, start in 3/4. You can completely abandon the old time signature. As long as you keep a pulse that's related to both, doesn't matter what time it is. I've circled a motive here for this tune. I don't know if anybody knows this tune. This was new to me. You know that one? Okay. That's a great little motive because all it's doing in F major is it starts on one of the chord tones for the tie, goes up and down, is a neighbor motion, and then it jumps to the next chord tone. That's it. That's really easy to work with. That's a great motive for us because we can play that on any chord we want. We could play that on D flat major. For example, very easy to work with. Okay, back to 4A. Those are the elements that we're going to use. Okay, so far. We are now going to set up our modulation by introducing a cadence in the new key, which for us is F major. The formula that we're going to use is given to you here. It relies on aiming for the minor 2 chord in the new key. And the reason for that is that the 2 chord as a predominant chord in a cadence, it specifically introduces the last flat in that key. So in F major, you can look at number 2 under modulate. F major, that 2 chord is a G minor chord. It's introducing a B flat, where we were in D major with 2 sharps. That G minor chord is giving us the B flat that appears in the key of F. It's guiding your listener's ear towards F major. So it's a great place to aim when you're doing a modulation. Now, if you look across that little double-headed arrow, that G minor chord has to relate to where we're coming from. We're coming from D major. In D major, a G chord is a 4 chord, a subdominant chord. The subdominant chord is actually a major chord in D major. but we don't care because we're going to F major. So we can make that a 4 chord in a minor chord, and that creates what we call a pivot chord. It's a chord that can relate to the key we're coming from and specifically relates to the key we're going to. So the progression that we're going to use is there in number 3. And you can see that pivot chord because it has that little stair step gizmo there that shows you the two different Roman numerals, but it's 1 chord. So the progression that we're going to hear sounds like this. This is D major where we started. Okay, D major, G minor, F with the C in the bass, dominant 7, tonic and F. So it sounds like this. We started in D and now we're in F. Works every time. I've actually written out those chords. That's number 4. They line up with the Roman numerals, so you can see what those chords are. In the case of this bridge, I've set aside a certain number of measures for each harmony so that it has a sort of natural pacing. We'll see that on the next page. Number 6 in this list, we are going to use the end of the tune in the new key as sort of the conclusion of our bridge. Much like you'd introduce a hymn in a congregation. You sort of wrap it up with the last line and people know to sing, for example. And that is also marked on page 4C. I've marked in a box, the end of that refrain is going to appear in our bridge. And then the final step is we play the beginning of our new tune. Now, if you turn to 4D, you see all of these elements coming together. The top line of page 4D shows us the end of the tune, Lauda Anima. That's the first tune. It sounds like this. Our bridge starts on line 2. That circled motive is the motive that we identified from the beginning of the second tune, Alabare. And I put in the chord symbol so you can see 4 bars of D, 4 bars of G minor. All we're doing is using that motive to arpeggiate around within each harmony. And I didn't even change the bass note. This is just a skeleton outline. Here's what the bridge sounds like. Now we're going to G minor. There's G minor. And now the end of the refrain. And then we play the beginning of the tune on the bottom of the line. Okay? Now, again, with the colleague exam and the limited time you have in the preparation room, this may be all that you write down. Chord symbols, the motive. You may even leave off those notes in the bass clef because you don't need them, they're on the chord symbols. I have, again, fleshed it out for you on 4E. Realizing the bridge, I put in the triads in the right hand, anywhere where there are no eighth notes. And I sort of elaborated a little bit on that bass line just to give it a little pep. So the whole bridge, fully realized, sounds like this. Worked. It's like magic. It got us there. And it had elements to unify it. Using that motive from the beginning of the second tune gives a unifying element to the whole bridge. It doesn't take much, just this little snippet that's recognizable. It gives you something to use within these harmonies. And all you do is find your pivot chord, follow the cadence, bang, you're there. I think it's kind of like magic. It's like a machine. You take your example, you put it in the beginning of the machine, you crank the handle, and then the fully realized thing comes out at the end. All you have to do is follow those steps. Are there any questions about what we did there? You okay? All right. Are there any questions about certification generally before I tackle one more thing? Okay. If you're willing to sit through 5 more minutes, I want to give you a little sample of what's on the associate exam. I know we had some people who were interested in that. One of the improvisation, actually, before we do that, there is one more page to your packet. It says how to practice on the top. You don't have to read all that right now. I will tell you that the list under each heading, it's almost the same list. And I did that on purpose. I made sure they were all in the same order. It's a set of skills, and you practice these skills. For example, work on your music theory a little bit, brush up on that, play your scales, practice cadences in all keys. Make sure you have a list that you are using in the time that's allotted during the exam, so that you can get to the, that's your machine, and you can put your example in the front, work it through, and at the end, you know what you're going to do when you start to play on the exam. Also, do replicate the exam conditions after you get comfortable with the skill set, so that you're practicing working in a 60-second time limit when that applies, for example. But for all of this stuff, it's a synthesis of skills. And that's why these examples seem difficult, because it's not a matter of just reading what's put in front of you. You have to use your musical knowledge and skills and create something musical as a result. Now, for that 5 minutes, and I appreciate you sitting here through this, I think this is something that everybody can do. The associate exam gives a hymn tune and says, play a prelude on this hymn. Now, if you're like me, that might seem like a huge, huge task. But if you have a system like we've been talking about, if you can rely on some very simple skills, you can create something relatively simply and put almost any tune into it and have it work. And I'm gonna show you an example. I was thinking about this tune in particular. This is Melita. It's the Navy hymn. I actually played this on Sunday for Veterans Day. I was thinking about this tune in particular, in part because I played it, but also because it has accidentals in it and chromaticisms in it. That's the kind of thing that can really confuse you when you're trying to improvise, because you're supposed to account for all these accidentals. I'll play the little passage here that has, we get F sharp in there near the end. All those chromaticisms. That's a lot to think about. My advice is we're not going to worry about those. We're going to change the mode of this altogether so that we can ignore every accidental that shows up. That's going to cause us not to have to think about that at all. We're going to create a toccata using a figuration that requires basically keeping your hand in one position. We're going to use little pedal punctuations that require only 2 notes, for example. So in this piece, Melita is in C major. We're actually, instead of C major, we're going to play this in C mixolydian. Here's C mixolydian, if you know your modes. The only difference is it's a B flat instead of a B natural. We can play this tune using those notes instead of the accidentals that are here. So far, so good. Here we go. F natural. So we have used B flat and we have ignored the F sharp altogether. 2 chords in the right hand. It's basically one hand position. We're going to anchor our pinky on a G. It's going to stay there the whole time. And we're going to arpeggiate some notes that are in a C major triad. I'm playing a D and an E with my first 2 fingers, and I'm playing a C with my thumb. It sounds like this. That's your toccata figure. The other that we're going to do is going to outline a mixolydian element. Basically the same pinky on the same G, and I'm going to arpeggiate a B flat major triad. That sounds like this. So put together, we can go back and forth whenever we want to. We're going to do that with the right hand. That pinky anchoring means you're not going to move that hand from that position. Those two things you have to remember. That's it. We're going to play the melody with the left hand in mixolydian mode. And when we get to the ends of phrases, have you ever heard the Westminster Carillon by Vierne? Big piece. He sets up a toccata figure, plays the melody with the left hand, and at the end of the phrase, he plunks down just a couple of little staccato pedal notes. And we're going to do the same thing. Vierne would love this. So I'm going to put one foot on G, that's the dominant in C major, and I'm going to put one foot on C. And I'm not going to move them. While you're reading the melody, anytime that the notes look like they're going towards, or going away from the tonic triad, we're going to use that second chord. And anytime they look like they're outlining the tonic triad, we're going to go back to the first chord. So, put together, see if you can trace all these elements. We've got this. We've got the melody here. Those things. Let's see if I can pull this off. Here we go. Worked. I think anybody could do that. It's not the most brilliant toccata I've ever heard, let me tell you, but it has the elements of toccata. A bigger registration would probably help it. And you can put almost any tune into that. How about this? This is a slightly different figure. Know this tune? And so it goes. If you find a pattern that works where you can lock your hand in place and do a figuration, alternating 2 different things, play a tune. That Silent Night example doesn't have accidentals. You can play it in B flat major. You don't need a mode. Tonic and dominant in the pedal, you've got yourself a toccata. You could do that at communion if there's extra time to fill. You could even do it in, do this one in C mixolydian, immediately jump to E flat major, do the same thing, come back to C. You got a whole postlude right there if you wanted to do it. I think anybody could do that. Okay, I'll stop going on. You can, I love that part. Okay, are there any questions about anything that we've talked about tonight? Okay, did it make sense enough that you feel a little bit inspired to go and give these things a try? I hope you are. All of these things are possible. You just have to get creative and be dedicated to your practice time. So good luck on the exams. And if you're in the Northern Virginia chapter and you're doing service playing or colleague, I might see you. Excellent. Thank you all for coming. Thank you everyone online who joined in. Thank you to Northern Virginia chapter, to Aaron, Steve, to the DC and Potomac chapters, and thank you all for being here. Good night.